All right, that's my summary on hearts, which is pay attention to your Dr. Boz ratio. Let's move on to my favorite organ to study, which is brains. All right, this is what most of my patients look like when they come to see me. They come to my clinic because their brain isn't working right. And the reason I was studying the ketogenic diet in the first place was to look at the fascination in brain repair after an injury, whether the injury was from Parkinson's or concussion or addiction. I was fascinated by how quickly they were repairing brains when they fueled the brain with a different fuel. So what fuel does our brain use? And if you look back at the textbooks from when I was in medical school, it taught us that brains use glucose. I will tell you that brains do use glucose, but when they are fueled with only glucose for years and years and years, we end up with some problems. These are a list of some of the problems that I take care of in my clinic and that have been successful in how we address that foggy brain, if you would. But when I look at the brain fuels that are possible, we now know that glucose and ketones can be used by the human brain. So the next question that these folks in 2016 were looking at is, well, if brains can use ketones, how quickly can we get that brain to switch from glucose to ketones? So they did a study. And that study came out in 2016. I didn't see it until this past year, where they took 10 healthy adults, and they were ages 20 to 50. They were on the standard American diet, and they studied their brains through PET scans. The PET scans were watching to see what happened when we switched their brain from glucose to ketones, and they thought it would probably take about a month to really get that brain up and using ketones effectively. So here's a picture of a PET scan, and we use the PET scans to look at different levels of activity. That brain activity is going to be linked to the substance we're studying, so the colors represent what level of brain activity is linked to the substance that we're looking at. So let's make that a little more clear by saying, if you look at this measuring units, this measuring tool and the units with it, this is the measuring unit for glucose. So when we have a blue, it was very little activity was using glucose. When it was mild, it was it was green, it was mild activity for using glucose. When it was yellow, it was moderate brain activity, and when it was red, it was high activity for their brain. As we looked at their brains, we first tagged glucose to measure how much of their brain was being fueled by glucose. Again, we infused that into their system, and then we did a scan of their brain. Then we said, well, now let's tag ketones and see if any of their brain is using ketones. So we again put that in there and did another PET scan looking at their brains for ketones. So the first scans were done on a standard American diet. The second scan was done after 4 days of a very high-fat ketogenic diet. In fact, if I had to analyze this diet, I would say it's very close to the diet that I would call a Paleolithic ketogenic diet. We'll get to that in a minute. Or the kind of diet that I would use as a prescription strength ketogenic diet for my seizure patients or those people using a ketogenic diet to help with their cancer treatment. So, what were the results? Okay, brain activity fueled by glucose for first day. Again, this is the glucose monitor, or the glucose meter, so you'll see 0 is kind of black and 36 is the highest it goes, and it's red. So on day 1, this is what their brains look like. Day 1, you will see that 98% of their brain was fueled by glucose. There is a bunch of red in there, there's a bunch of yellow, and again, that's how most of our brains are functioning. If you look, there's very little space where there's a low amount of glucose being taken up by the brain. By day 4 of the high-fat ketogenic diet, I want you to watch carefully as I push the button to see what happened by day 4 of this high-fat ketogenic diet. Keep in mind, we thought this was going to take several weeks to get those mitochondria in the brain using ketones. Wow, look at that. The amount of activity in their brain that was mild to moderate amounts of glucose was in 4 days. Like, well, what would their brain be doing if it wasn't using glucose anymore? So let's show you what happened with ketones. Here we tagged ketones like we did the glucose, and again, the higher the intensity of use, the more red and yellow you'll see. Blue says practically no ketones are being used. So on day 1, here's the measuring unit for ketones, which is different than the measuring unit for glucose, but almost zero brain activity was fueled by ketones on day 1 for these people eating the standard American diet. By day 4 of this high-fat ketogenic diet, you can see an intense amount of areas that have suddenly started using ketones within 4 days. That is a powerful teaching moment for me as a physician to say, well, if we can just get ketones into the brain, maybe we can see some of these other things improve before I teach them all about how to change their diet. So, glucose versus ketones. Here is day 1. Top one is glucose, the bottom one is ketones. And just to drive home this point, here is what happened at day 4. The reduction of use of glucose and the incredible increase in the use of ketones on day 4. This was a game changer in my clinic when I saw this. Our brain is fueled by glucose and by ketones, but let's take a look at the brains that are the hardest for me to take care of. In those patients, I talk about something called the brain gap. Brain gap means when we look at the ketogenic medium chain triglycerides, we can increase the brain energy metabolism in my most difficult patients, and those would be Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease, boy, if you want to see a way to ignite prevention, I would have you come look at the folks in my clinic that struggle with Alzheimer's. This will make you very interested in wanting to know much more about medium chain triglycerides. So for those newbies in the audience, I'll just remind you, medium chain triglycerides are chains of fat, and they are like Goldilocks. They're not the small ones. They're not the large ones. They are medium, and that means they are 8 to 10 carbons in length. So I've circled them here, and specifically I want you to remember the code of C8, C10. That is what your labels should say on the back are in the supplements of medium chain triglycerides. You'll get some of the cheaper supplements out there that use C12, and by golly, they are not the beneficial triglyceride. The reason we want C8 and C10 is that these two fat chains do not need digested. They can be absorbed, go directly into that portal vein. That portal vein dumps them into the liver, and the liver churns them through the mitochondria in the cells of your liver, and you have ketones within circulation about 20 to 30 minutes after you take in fats 8 or 10 carbons long. All right, so that's a quick summary of medium chain triglycerides. Let's look at the data. The ketogenic medium chain triglycerides increase brain energy metabolism in Alzheimer's disease. And here's what the studies show. If you look at this, this brain energy thing, okay, brain energy, what I want you to remember is 88. If you have 88% of the brain cells functioning, they couldn't measure a brain that wasn't functioning right. Meaning if 88% of the brain cells were being fueled and had plenty of energy, we couldn't measure any memory problems. It doesn't mean their brains were perfect. It just means they didn't have any outward symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So let's look at this study and see what we're looking at. We're going to study what was the brain using for glucose, how much of the brain was using ketones, and was there any energy gap. The types of people that we looked at in this study were those that were young, healthy people. That's you and I in the room. They were older folks who did not have a memory problem. And then there were the mild memory problems. And I'll tell you, with our baby boomers in the age they're at, this was not hard to find people with mild memory problems. They still lived in their homes. They still drive cars. But when it comes to measuring their memory, they were right on the edge. They had just a few symptoms. And I would contend that their energy gap was right there on the edge of 88% of their brain was being fueled, while about that 12% of their brain was just screaming, saying, hey, can you give me some fuel? Can you give me some energy? Let's take a look at how this turned out. The young, healthy group had perfect energy. It had 100%. 95% glucose, 5% of their brain ran on ketones, and they had zero energy gap. They were perfect. They had no problems. We move on to the older with no memory problems, and you can see that their glucose was above the 88%. It was actually at 89. They got 3 extra points for the part of their brain that used ketones, but they still had an 8% energy gap that was present in their brains. The mild memory problems were those people who were, again, right at 88%. Their brains had memory problems. They did not perform perfectly on the memory test that we gave them. They didn't have enough diagnostic criteria to be called Alzheimer's. They were just called mild cognitive impairment, MCI. And again, this is a scary place to be, because to me, in my clinic, this was that point where they were just on the edge of the point of no return. So they had 85% of their brain fueled by glucose, 3% by ketones, leaving a 12% deficit. Now what happened when we added MCT, medium chain triglycerides, specifically the C8-C10? That would be not digested but absorbed into their body and circulating ketones throughout their system. We found that they had 84% of their glucose, again, not much change from the other markers, from their counterparts, but we were able to increase their ketone fuel in their brain by 4%. This pushed them above that 88%, now functioning as if they had no memory problems. Still had a 9% deficit overall, but I'll take it. That 91% means they do not have measurable symptoms of Alzheimer's that I can get in my clinic. Finally, if we had 45 grams of that MCT, even more. The glucose doesn't change at all, but now we had 10% of their brain burning ketones using that as their fuel. We only had a 6% deficit, which was actually better than the folks that were in the that second column there. And how did they do it? They did it because their brain gap was only 6%, and they had increased the amount of their brain using ketones, which improved their cognitive performance. So what does this have all to do? By the way, that data came out in 2018, so again, just recently around the corner, but I will tell you it was another game changer for my patients that are struggling. We know that brains prefer ketones over glucose, but you've got to get those ketones in circulation in order for the patients to take advantage of it. So this was, again, one of those places where I wrote a book teaching my mom about ketones and glucose, but I have had some very humble pie pieces come to me as far as brain performance and what ketones have to offer. I will say that as my patients who have tremors and concentration and anger issues and irritable moods and depression and brain injuries, when they struggle with a brain that's not working right, I've learned start with not hanging out in that fog of only using glucose to fuel their brain. Boost their brain by adding